In 1700, India led global manufacturing in textiles and crafts, and its share of global GDP was approximately a quarter of the world's total by independence. Its industries had collapsed while Britain surged, and India's share was around 4%. The reason goes beyond technology. Deliberate colonial policy engineered the market. The financial story is different. Systemic extraction will demonstrate how famine-era tax collection, legal annexation, and tariff engineering formed a closed-loop capital transfer. Think of it like a pipeline. Tax revenue primes it, the doctrine of lapse widens it, and trade policy accelerates it. Now, the key question is how a trading firm secured that tax pipeline from trader to tax state begins where the ledger overtakes the map. The British East India Company's business model shifted from buying and selling to taxing and remitting. After the Battle of Buxar in 1764, the British East India Company gained the Diwani, the right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Through the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765, commerce became sovereign extraction. Revenue offices were retooled into cash machines with a single priority: remit funds outward consistently and on schedule. Crucially, the rates climbed. Contemporary accounts describe assessments that often captured 50 to 80% of gross agricultural income, higher than those under Mughal administration. So the same fields now serviced a larger claim. To understand this, follow the money. Tax receipts no longer cycled through village repair, irrigation, or relief. They financed purchases of Indian goods for export. In economic terms, the colony paid itself for the privilege of selling. The ledger balanced in London, not in Bengal's markets. If you rely on local grain dealers and cloth brokers for liquidity, this matters. Cash moved upward, leaving empty tills below. Use a simple analogy. You walk into a shop, the cashier takes your wallet, buys the store's goods with your money, hands you a receipt, and calls it fair trade. That was the flow. Taxes funded the purchase of exports, turning trade into an accounting loop that drained working capital from the places that produced the goods. When the take rises above prior norms, the loop tightens and the floor under local commerce gives way. Research demonstrates a pattern. As rates rose, arrears triggered land loss. Assessments did not bend for illness, drought, or failed harvests. During the Bengal famine of 1769 to 1770, collections continued while relief lagged. The death toll was catastrophic. Roughly 1/3 of Bengal's population, on the order of 10 million lives. That choice aligned with the model: protect remittances, defer local spending. You see the logic when you treat revenue as collateral for expansion and dividends rather than a budget for subsistence. Look at the administrative gears. The company outsourced collection to revenue farmers who bid for the right to squeeze an area. Rights were auctioned and winners had to extract enough to meet fixed targets and still profit. The winning bidder passed targets down to village headmen and intermediaries. Enforcement measured success by remittances, not by survival rates. If we analyze that chain, the incentives stacked toward over-extraction. Each layer needed a margin. The peasant became the only adjustable line item. The result was a cash drain. Local liquidity vanished. Credit tightened because lenders saw higher risk and fewer reliable repayments. Debt spiraled as cultivators borrowed to meet fixed assessments. With each season, more land moved into forfeiture, then into the hands of those plugged into the revenue system. When the fiscal calendar dictates what you plant, and when you sell, resilience erodes. A bad monsoon stops being a shock and becomes a trap. This flow funded more than trade. It bankrolled military expenses and corporate payouts. The same rupees that left villages purchased textiles for export, then serviced obligations on the company's books. The public saw commerce. The ledger recorded a transfer mechanism. By the time goods reached port, profit pools sat offshore. Meanwhile, the interior ran on thinner margins, weaker credit, and delayed wages. If you test the system against a basic welfare function, it fails. Relief did not scale when food vanished. The tax pipeline did. That is not an accident. It is the architecture. Fixed targets, auctioned rights, and a reporting culture built to satisfy distant shareholders produce predictable numbers. They also produce predictable scarcity. The pivot is clear. A firm that once bargained with rulers now issued demands as a sovereign. It wrote the rules, enforced the rates, and defined what counted as success. That authority converted taxes into a stable funding stream for exports and coercive capacity. The next level was legal, how rules about succession and sovereignty could widen the base that fed this system. Law offered a cheaper expansion path and turned territorial decisions into financial ones. Annexation, in this frame, was not only about flags, it was about converting jurisdiction into revenue streams. Call it annexation as a balance sheet. To understand why territory mattered, ask the key question: why did law become the fastest route to new revenue? If taxation built a steady pipeline, annexation expanded the pipe itself. Legal doctrine turned succession into a switch you could flip. When the law declared a line broken, revenue changed owners in a single administrative act. No siege, no months of campaign finance, just paperwork that converted sovereignty into cash flow. The Doctrine of Lapse operationalized that switch. No male heir meant no recognized sovereignty. Adoption claims, common in regional practice, faced rejection under a new standard. Under Lord Dalhousie's tenure, its application ramped up and drew controversy, including within British circles that viewed it as a breach of existing treaties. Key cases demonstrate the pattern: Satara in 1848, Jhansi in 1853, and Nagpur in 1854. Each shifted from indirect influence to direct company rule, and treasuries, land revenues, and fees dropped into company ledgers. Succession disputes became fiscal triggers. In economic terms, inheritance rules were repurposed as a revenue mechanism. Legal language provided a shield. The stated aim was orderly governance. The practical effect was access to treasuries, rents, and administrative receipts. If we analyze the incentives, the appeal is clear. A rule that tightens the definition of succession reduces uncertainty, but it also accelerates the integration of revenue streams. Annexation by law costs less than annexation by war. It also produces numbers you can forecast. Each annexation expanded the tax base and secured routes that mattered for resource movement control. Over corridors meant safer remittance paths, more reliable grain and cotton flows, and tighter grip on customs points. That kind of control matters when your business model depends on predictable exports and timely remittances. If the map is a balance sheet, new districts are line items, assets that yield rent, fees, and control over transit. Use one simple analogy. Think of the frontier as a series of toll gates. Each annexation moves the toll booth forward and standardizes the fee. Once the fee is set, the cash hits the account on schedule. The gains were doubled. Eliminate subsidies previously paid to allied rulers and gain immediate access to their treasuries. That dual effect explains why annexation aligned so neatly with company finances. Consider the case of Jhansi, where adoption rights failed under the doctrine. Administrators entered, assessed, and folded accounts into existing systems. The disputed heir vanished from the ledger. The district appeared under a new column. The political drama often draws attention, but the balance sheet tells you what happened next. Operational details cemented the shift. Pensions were reduced or terminated. Not only royal stipends, but payments to nobles, military officers, and other traditional elites. Civil lists were revised to cut allowances and reallocate funds to general revenue. New assessments set collection targets that matched remittance obligations. Officials updated settlement records, revalued land, and tightened fee schedules for courts, stamps, and transit. Each line item pushed toward a predictable cash flow that could back borrowing and dividends. The resentment this generated among dispossessed elites fed into broader unrest that would erupt in 1857. The costs of conquest did not vanish. They were pushed onto Indian taxpayers and Indian regiments. Local revenue paid for the operations that extended the same architecture. The cycle reinforced itself. Annexation increased the base. The base funded expansion. Expansion generated more base. In accounting terms, the system capitalized its own growth with local resources. This is where we see how financial architecture can mask coercion. The annexation appears as administration, but it functions like a financing instrument. You raise near-term cash by absorbing treasuries. You lock in long-term revenue by widening the tax net and securing routes. If we analyze the resulting market power, the next mechanism becomes visible: control over price signals through tariff walls and internal duties. Tariffs that broke an industry shows how pricing rules reshaped production. The puzzle is clear. How does a global textile leader become a captive buyer of foreign cloth in a few decades? The answer sits in tariffs and market design. Britain placed steep barriers on Indian finished cloth entering the UK, ranging up to 400% in some cases, while keeping British textiles entering India tariff-free. That asymmetry didn't just tilt the field, it rewired demand. Internal transit duties compounded the tilt. Moving yarn or cloth across districts inside India added costs at every gate. Those taxes fragmented the domestic market, while British goods moved freely, creating a second disadvantage that local producers could not offset with efficiency alone. Export controls and monopolies narrowed who could ship and under what terms. Together, these rules restricted the networks that once linked looms, brokers, ports, and overseas buyers. If we analyze the trade flow, the pattern is straightforward. India shipped raw cotton, Manchester spun and finished it. The cloth returned to India at volume and at price points local looms could not match. The loss wasn't only at the port, it spread inland as cheaper factory-made cloth displaced handloom sales in district bazaars. Once the client base shifted, credit to weavers tightened and orders dried up. Think of the whole system as a one-way conduit. Raw materials flowed out under policies that favored extraction. Profits pooled in British mills where machinery and scale locked in efficiency gains. Finished goods then flooded back along the same routes, now guarded by tariff-free access and administrative priority. Indian producers faced a valve that opened outward for cotton and closed against finished cloth. Industrial metrics underscored the shift. India's share of global textile and manufacturing output fell from roughly a quarter in the mid-18th century to about 2% by 1900. That decline tracks with the policy environment. Protective duties abroad raised the relative price of Indian finished goods. At the same time, cheap British cloth, free of import barriers in India, undercut local price points. British textile imports into India expanded rapidly, rising from around 5 million to 18 million between 1850 and 1896. The demand curve bent toward the mills that enjoyed both policy shelter and scale economies. Price dynamics did the rest. When a tariff lifts the price of your export several times over, you lose the foreign buyer, even if your product is strong. When the competing import enters your home market without a tariff, you lose the local buyer, even if your craft is efficient at small scale. The market signals become circular. Falling orders push up unit costs. Higher unit costs confirm the narrative of inefficiency, and investment shifts away from your sector. This was not a neutral environment that happened to favor one side. The design moved demand out of Indian workshops and into British factories. Internal duties raised friction on every mile of domestic movement. External tariffs blocked the path to the UK market. Export monopolies and administrative controls constrained alternative channels. Each rule tied a knot in the same rope. The effect cascaded beyond textiles. As cotton moved out, other raw materials followed similar patterns. Toolmakers, dyers, and spinners lost linked orders. Skills atrophied as apprenticeships stalled. The ecosystem around the loom, credit, transport, wholesale, thinned. By the time imported cloth saturated markets, local production networks had lost both resilience and bargaining power. The payoff is direct. Tariff asymmetry and market design converted India into a supplier of raw materials and a guaranteed consumer base. The mills that captured the margin were not in the towns where the cotton grew, they were where protective policy and capital converged. That convergence translated into machinery upgrades, higher throughput, and predictable dividends. Now the question shifts from prices to flows. If trade policy diverted profits to distant mills and merchants, where did the surplus move next, and through which accounts did it travel? We move from prices to instruments. The dark money loop is the system that translated colonial revenues into metropolitan capital without visible friction. So what did the capital flow look like when we track it end to end? Taxes strip liquidity from local markets. Annexations widened the base that fed that stream. Trade rules then diverted the profits toward British mills and merchants. The sequence matters. Extraction started at the village ledger and ended in balance sheets an ocean away. The surplus did not circulate where it was produced. It moved through company accounts and shareholder dividends. It sat inside debt instruments that promised returns far from the fields that generated the cash. It passed through London's financial markets, where instruments multiplied it and detached it from the places that paid the initial bill. To understand this, map the mechanisms. Home charges drew regular payments from Indian revenues to cover administration administration, military costs, pensions, and interest, importantly including interest on debts run up to finance imperial expansion. In effect, India serviced the cost of its own subjugation and the conquest of other territories. Those payments flowed outward as an obligation, not a trade. Remittances handled private transfers and official flows alike, keeping the stream pointed to London. Sterling balances held Indian reserves in London accounts, providing a ready pool for British investment and public spending. By the end of World War II, the accumulation was so large that Britain owed India significant sums, effectively making a colony. Its major creditor, council bills, facilitated conversion and movement, allowing profits earned in India to be realized in Britain without shipping coin. The paper itself cleared value, making extraction efficient and less visible. Think of it like a siphon fitted to multiple valves. Each valve, home charges, remittances, sterling balances, council bills, directed the same underlying value into a different channel, but every channel fed the same reservoir. If we analyze the design, the outcome becomes predictable. Local liquidity thinned, external pools deepened. Now link the pool to industry capital, drawn through these channels, financed machinery upgrades, canals, and rail construction in Britain. The deployment favored projects that accelerated throughput in factories and lowered transport costs at home. Meanwhile, rail policy in India aligned with extraction. Lines prioritized corridors that moved raw materials to ports and carried imported goods inland. Indian taxpayers funded the guarantees behind construction. Equipment had to be procured from British manufacturers, and operating profits flowed to British shareholders. The loop was circular. Indian revenues underwrote infrastructure that served export, while returns accrued in London. The logic was stated as connectivity, but the function was logistics. For a trade monopoly, grain, cotton, and opium moved efficiently to harbours. Manchester cloth and other manufactures returned with similar efficiency. Freight tables and routing schedules mirrored the priorities of revenue and export, not the needs of local exchange or resilience. If you needed to ship between nearby districts that lacked a port-facing line, the system did not serve you with the same speed. Continuity showed up during scarcity. When local economies needed liquidity most, finance still took precedence. Collections held to schedule, while relief came secondary to remittance obligations. That is how a financial architecture asserts itself. It converts welfare questions into accounting questions, and then follows the spreadsheet. If you find this analysis valuable, hit the like button. By the time the money reached London, its origin looked like a line item. Home charges appeared as routine payments. Balances looked like prudent reserves. Council bills looked like a neutral clearing mechanism. Dividends looked like standard returns. The accounting masked the transfer's social cost, while the capital deepened Britain's industrial base. The effects compounded. Investment in British infrastructure raised productivity at home, which reinforced the trade pattern that kept Indian producers as suppliers and buyers rather than competitors. This is the payoff. If the architecture had extraction in accounting lines, the headline number becomes a proxy for the unseen flows. The dark money loop aggregated countless transactions into a single metropolitan surplus. In the next step, we weigh the scale of that surplus and address the range of estimates that define the ledger it left behind. Now we confront the headline claim directly. The $45 trillion ledger. Economist Utsa Patnaik has calculated the colonial drain at roughly $45 trillion, though other estimates vary. The key point is scale. Even conservative calculations run into multiple trillions, which demonstrates the magnitude of transfer. Regardless of method, the mechanism matters more than any single figure. If we analyze the financial architecture, we see a repeatable extraction mechanism that transmitted value outward and embedded systemic inequality. Think of a ledger that shapes incentives across time. Modern research links colonial extraction to European industrialization and ongoing global inequality. Debt structures and trade imbalances between North and South continue to mirror unequal exchange.